and I noticed that quite a few of you are new associate members, so that's terrific. I'm glad you could make it tonight. So our speaker today is Melissa Weaver Dunning, and she's going to talk about traditional knitting from England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Shetland Islands. And perhaps you heard me say earlier that I've heard this talk. I am not a knitter, and it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm happy to hear it a second time. And so Melissa is an avid tartan and linen weaver, a skilled spinner, and a compulsive knitter. She loves to share the history and context of traditional textile arts and to pass on the efficient techniques of time-honored skills. She lives in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley of West Virginia. Melissa is also a traditional hand weaver working on antique equipment to produce 18th and 19th century style textiles. She has had the great good fortune to study with Scottish master weaver and singer Norman Kennedy since 1980. She is dedicated to carrying on some of the wealth of tradition gleaned from this apprenticeship, both in weaving and in music, and I've heard her sing too, and that's also amazing. If you would put your questions in the chat or hold them till the end, we would appreciate it. So Melissa, we're ready for you. You're muted.
Okay, let me start over. Okay, go away, little picture. Okay, hi. I'm very honored to be invited to speak to this group, and I'm so excited there are so many of you. It's really great to reach such a big audience. And I will apologize, my voice is pretty hoarse. I am still recovering from COVID after almost 2 weeks, but I have cough drops at the ready and water, and I will do my best. And I just want to mention before I get started, because I know so many of you are with so many affiliated guilds, that I have a list of 8 or 10 lectures that I've been doing throughout the pandemic for virtual programming for guilds. So if you're interested, that is something that I'm available for. And I also have a resource list that accompanies this lecture of related books, and mostly books. And I don't know if there's any way to send that to people who signed up, or you can send me an email and I'll send it to you. I think my email's on the very last slide, or I'll give it to you at the end. So anyway,
we can post the handout with the recording when we put it up on the website.
Oh, cool. Oh, that's great. So I'll send it to you when I'm done. Okay, so you should see my first slide. And rats. When I make it big, I lose the ability to make it play. There we go. Okay, so now you should see my first slide. And it should be big. And I should be quite small. All right, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about traditional knitting from England, Ireland, and Scotland. And I like to start with a map just because I like to see where I'm going. That's just part of how my brain works. So one of the important things about much of what we're going to talk about, or the main thing we're going to talk about first, has to do with all that shoreline and all the fishing and all of the transportation by boats, and we'll get to that in a minute. So first thing we need is sheep. And I apologize for the pixelated quality of some of these pictures. They've come from a lot of different sources, but these are all sheep. This one is probably on Shetland, based on the stone walls. Sorry, on the Aran Islands. And this is a picture of people shearing, and you'll note that they're kneeling on the ground to shear. This is the way shearing has been done in many countries for many centuries. This is a man and a woman who are both shearing, and they have, it's more in the modern style of positioning the sheep on its backside and crouching over the sheep to do the shearing. And here we have a group of ladies who've put on their best clean aprons and bonnets to have their picture taken outside of a cottage. And we have a lady with hand cards, and we have two different styles of wheels. And the woman who's standing has her knitting in her hands, although it's almost impossible to see. And I love to include this picture because this is the style of spinning that I was taught by Norman Kennedy in the early 80s. And he says it's not my way, it's just the way that he was also taught. So this is your standard long draw worsted woolen spinning style. And this is a woman in the Hebrides. And here we have a woman who is knitting with double pointed needles. She's got at least 3 needles with her stitches and probably a 4th needle. And I can't tell if she's using a knitting belt, but we'll see that later. The string around her neck is probably her specs. It is certainly not her yarn, because we can see that she's knitting something dark and there's a ball in her lap. But she probably spun and wove everything or knitted everything she's wearing. She certainly knitted the shawl on her head, her benach. And there are a remarkable number of pictures of women knitting while working, while walking, while leading oxen, while going to market, while watching animals where there are not fences. And I have a whole series of pictures here of women knitting while they're carrying peat. The basket on this probably very small woman's back weighs somewhere between 50 and 70 pounds. And she had been carrying loads like this from an early age, and all women, particularly in Shetland, but also other places, were accustomed to knitting at every opportunity they had, because it was one of the only ways that they could provide goods for barter and sometimes for cash. So this would have been just a matter of routine. And here we have another woman. Norman Kennedy talks about being out in the Hebrides when they were cutting peat, and one of the women stepped away for a minute, and he thought, well, he'd just pick up her basket just to be helpful. And he got the basket up on his back, but the string pulled, the cord that's going across her chest pulled so tightly and so heavily against his chest, he could barely breathe. And the woman came back and said, oh, laddie, put that down. You'll do yourself an injury. And he noticed that when she put the basket up on her back, she curved her shoulders forward to keep the weight of the cord off of her chest and her lungs. So there's a real knack to it. And here we have a woman, she's walking past a thatched cottage, and the ropes on the thatch, there are different methods of thatching, but particularly in coastal areas, on islands, in very windy places, they would put a network of ropes that were weighted with heavy rocks. If any of you saw the movie The Secret of Rowan Inish, the children there refurbish a cottage on an island, and they thatch the roof, and then they throw rocks up over the ropes with rocks attached, and the rocks dangle at the front of the cottage. And it's just another way of securing that thatch. But here we have this lady just knitting away. Doesn't look like she's bothered at all by this weight on her back. And 2 women, nice to have company while you're doing your work. You can chat a little, I guess, if you've got any wind at all to talk with. And here we have 2 ladies from the Aran Islands. They are wearing those striped petticoats, the word that they would use for their outer skirt. They're wearing haps or shawls, as well as a head covering, and they're theoretically, at least whoever titled the postcard, they're coming back from market, but they could just as easily be going to market. And here we have a wonderful staged image of a group of women knitting together. And I love the way the photographer has directed this scene, because you have women knitting from balls, but 2 of them have skeins very artfully arranged on their arm or their knee. And I have heard of, and I myself have knit straight from a skein. It's not really much of a party trick. It just isn't done very often, but you can open up a skein, knit from it, carefully taking off 1 strand at a time. And when you're done, twist it back up into a skein. And it's a possibility, but most of us would prefer to wind a ball. But anyway, here we have these ladies all knitting in the parlor. And this picture is here just to show you a pretty good angle of how the knitting belt is used. So knitters, particularly knitters who knit for money or who were trying to clothe a large family, imagine if all of your stockings came from your grandmother's needles or your mother's needles. The fastest way to knit is to anchor one of your needles, and a variety of different devices have been used. Some styles have you put the needle under your armpit or your elbow. Some have a sort of forked implement with a cup at the top, like a fat stick that has a fork at the bottom and a smoothed out cup. That's put into the belt or over the apron strap, and the needle is placed in that cup. The Shetlanders and many other knitters throughout Britain have used some kind of a knitting belt. And in this case, it's a leather, perforated leather, which has a horsehair or some other coarse filling. And one of the long double pointed needles, for most knitters, it's your right hand needle is anchored in, no, sorry, your left hand needle is anchored. And that way your right hand can work against that needle, which never moves, and it's extremely efficient. The fastest knitter in the world is Hazel Tyndall. She's won several competitions, and she knits with a belt. Although I think she wasn't allowed to use her belt for the competition, but she's still super fast. So here we have another lovely staged family with the mother and the grandmother knitting away, and the kids are winding yarn, and they're bits of knitting and skeins very artfully arranged everywhere. And the father, I hope, is reading out loud to everybody, because this was a common practice. If you had someone in the house who could read, and as the middle class evolved, that was not uncommon, that was the norm. But to have somebody to read the news to you or to read a novel to you while you were doing your work in the evening. This is before there was much TV, any TV, and before there was much radio. Okay, now we're going to talk about ganzis. So ganzis are fishermen's sweaters. They are working garments, and their specific style is they were traditionally dark blue. A man might have a wedding gansy or a Sunday best gansy. The patterning was sometimes all over, but predominantly in the chest area, shoulders, upper sleeves. And this is because, as we'll see in some other photographs, the kind of coverall that men wore at sea would cover everything except that area. So they didn't bother putting decoration where it wouldn't be seen. These sweaters were knitted in one piece from the bottom up and steeked at the armhole openings and possibly at the front neck if there was neck shaping. They were tightly knitted. They were made with 3/4 length sleeves so that where the cuff met your skin, if it's halfway up your arm, it doesn't move around much. If it's at your wrist with all of the twisting of work, it would have gotten wet with salt water and would have chafed and created skin problems. So 3/4 inch length sleeve. So they were worked from the welt up. They didn't necessarily have ribbing. So that lower portion of decoration is called a welt. And they all had underarm gussets so that a tightly fitting garment would work for active work, for busy movement. And so here you can see that the body, the like belly portion of this sweater is plain. And the patterning is up at the top. This one has an all over pattern. Ganzis have all kinds of different textured stitches, and they often have simple rope cables. Excuse me. This has a pattern of rope cables and a textured stitch, but it begins at that midpoint. This has more of a what's called, we would call this a moss stitch or a seed stitch. Norman says people would call it poor man's wealth because it was hard to count. Here we have a fellow with furrows and other textured stitches on his gansy. This is a very simple Gansey with a plain rib at the bottom and a wider rib, although I think there's like I think there are little pearl diamonds going up those wide ribs. And this is the underarm gusset. And the gusset is the thing that makes it possible to have that tight fitting garment, but still be a working garment successfully. Gussets were sometimes patterned, sometimes had a false seam or rose out of a false seam because it was knitted in the round. But the seams really help you find your place in the pattern. And then here we have a group of herring lassies. There were a lot of women, generally young women, often unmarried, but sometimes married, who would follow the herring fishing, and they would gut the fish so that it could be packed into barrels with salt and kept. And they are also seen knitting whenever they had a chance, because they too were part of this deep work ethic of producing knitwear and never being idle. So this is a group of herring lassies, and that's probably the little hut that they're staying in, and they're socializing after hours. This is a really wonderful picture. And actually, we can thank Norman Kennedy for this picture. He was visiting home and went with his mother to where she was cleaning offices in the off hours in the evenings. And he found this and a group of other photographs in a trash can and saved it. And so we don't have any other source for it except that Norman found it. Excuse me. Here's a group of herring lassies. They're probably between ships. So they've got their coveralls, their big aprons on, and they're just knitting away and chatting with some fellas. And this is a lovely design that was made by Elizabeth Lovick, who lives in the Hebrides. And she produced this pattern called the Scottish Herring Girls Gansey. She found, she set out to disprove that women only knitted for men and that only men wore Ganseys. And she found quite a few pictures, including one that was good enough that she could base this pattern off of it, of women wearing Ganseys as well. This is my teacher and friend and mentor, Norman Kennedy. And he was visiting our house and he needed some promo pictures. So my husband took a whole series of photographs of him. And the sweater that he's wearing is a Gansey, and he spun on a spindle and plied this roving. Somebody gave him a big ball of roving that was 50% wool and 50% silk. And one winter he spun it and plied it while he was on his travels. And then he knit this Gansey, and it has rope cables. It has the seed stitch poor man's wealth. I think it's got some furrows on the back. We'll see some of his other garments as well. Here's the back of this sweater with these lovely fat cables. And I like that kind of a oblong checkerboard. And here's the side. And is that really the same sweater? Excuse me. I'm so sorry about the coughing. And the furrows, the pair of zigzag furrows are called marriage lines because in marriage there are ups and downs. This is Gordon Reed, who's from Caithness in Scotland, and he has a website with an extraordinary amount of information about Ganseys, and this is one of the many Ganseys that he has knitted. Okay, we're going to move on to Aran knitting. I'm going to have a drink of water. So now we're looking at the Aran Islands, which are on the west coast of Ireland, just off Galway Bay. And the main islands are Inishore, Inishmain, and Inishmore. And Aran Islands knitting, although there are quite a few stories about the origins of Aran knitting, including a German man who crafted a very complex connection between the illustrations in the Book of Kells and the cables on modern Aran sweaters. There's actually no evidence of Aran sweaters having been around before the 1920s. This is a sample of a group of stitches for an Aran sampler with a braided cable, a rope cable, and some moss stitch and seed stitch as well. This is one of the earliest of the Aran sweaters, and this comes from a museum in Dublin. And the best theory that anyone has come up with, in my opinion, is that many Irish girls and girls from other European countries came to New York City and other parts of the United States to work and make money to send home. And there was a girl from the Aran Islands who went to New York City, and on her half day, her, half a day that she had off from work, she went to Central Park or some other park and met a young woman who was from Bavaria. Bavaria has a long tradition of stitches that look very much like this particular sweater, with twisted, raised stitches and more of an etched look to the designs. And the girl from Aran saw this sweater and learned about this kind of knitting and brought it home and showed her mother and her auntie and her granny and her neighbor, and it spread all over. And they said, well, we could make fancy sweaters like this. And the main difference between Ganseys and Aran sweaters are that Aran sweaters are, first of all, they're white. They're not working garments. White is not a practical color for a working garment. They're worked in pieces and seamed, and they were, from the very beginning, knitted for sale, with some exceptions, knitted for their boyfriends and husbands as a Sunday best garment, never as a working garment. They have a gusset at the bottom, a symmetrical array of various stitches, and they certainly showed off the knitters' prowess, their experience as knitters. These are some still photos from Singh's Man of Aran film. And this fellow is wearing pampooties on his feet, which are untanned cowskin, and they're left in a bucket of water by the door when they come in at night and then put on your feet. And they provide the best, most secure footing on the rocky terrain that you find on this particular island and many other shore areas. He's wearing homespun trousers and his beautiful white Aran sweater and his little tan hat. And we get a better look at his sweater here. He's got marriage lines, many of similar features to the textured patterning of the Ganseys, but Aran sweaters are always all over, so there's no blank area. And they tend to be knitted with thicker yarn, have bolder motifs and bobbles and trinity stitch. The kind of blackberry stitch are also features that are not found in Ganseys, but are found in Aran sweaters. These are typical Aran sweaters. This is a pattern leaflet. And then if you've been to Ireland, depending on when you went and where you went, you might see Aran sweater shops, Aran sweater markets. This is a pretty famous American film star on the set wearing his beautiful Aran sweater. These are the Clancy brothers and Tommy Macon, who were a famous part of the folk revival in America. And the first story I heard was that one of their mothers heard how cold it was in New York City and sent them sweaters. And I heard for years one of their mothers knitted all the sweaters, but it turned out that one of their mothers sent some sweaters and they wore them on a television show. And their manager was ecstatic and said they must always wear these sweaters. So that's how they appeared. Here they are a little bit later, the Clancy brothers with Louis Killen, in also, again, beautiful Aran sweaters. This is a sweater that Norman Kennedy made, and he used some of the patterns from Gladys Thompson's book, which is primarily about Ganseys, but has a section on Aran sweaters in the back. So this is more old style than, say, what the Clancy brothers wore or what you might find today. And this is an interesting website that I found It is not historically accurate. It is a great story for tourists and a good story for trying to sell sweaters and sweater patterns. There are not historic family patterns of Aran sweaters, and they're probably not as old as this website might imply. But the designs are beautiful. So here we have one from that website, another from that website. You see twisted stitches on this one, much as we did on that oldest sweater at the very beginning. This is an Aran style sweater designed by a Japanese designer. Aran sweaters are popular throughout the world. This is an Afghan square from the Great American Aran Afghan, which was a contest that Knitters Magazine put on. And I love this particular designer's use of baubles and cables to make a tree and a little seed stitch for a cloud. I think it's just very inventive use of this set of stitch types. Okay, we're going to move on to Shetland lace. The Shetland Islands are very far north from Scotland, closer to Norway than Scotland, were owned by Norway for centuries and have more of a Norse culture than a Celtic culture. And you can also see tiny Fair Isle about halfway between Shetland and Orkney in this picture. One of the wonderful things about Shetland knitting is the many, many colors that we get from Shetland sheep, which naturally have a very wide variety of colors. And this is a postcard of a variety of Shetland, traditional Shetland lace patterns. One of the things that is unique about Shetland lace is that it's a garter stitch lace. Shetlanders don't like to purl, they don't like to cast on, and they don't like to bind off. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go on, just ways of making things without having to do those things. These are Shetland haps, large shawls that are being blocked on frames. So they've had heavy cord laced through all of the lace points, and they're stretched out wet so that they can dry, and it'll open up the patterning so you can see the lace better. This is a smaller shawl that's laced out to block, so you get a better idea of how it's done. This particular shawl would have had the very outside edging knitted first, stitches picked up around it on one section, and one of those trapezoid shaped lace sections knitted, then the next, and then stitches picked up at one side and the garter section knitted down while picking up stitches from the edge and the last edge grafted together. That's the kind of structure that Shetlanders use to manage their projects without casting on very many stitches or binding off very many, and with never purl stitches. This is a little triangular hat or a shoulder shawl. Same kind of structure. Here is a shawl very similar to the ones we saw in the old picture being stretched. This is the one of the favorite of the kind of wave patterns, old shale it's called. Sometimes there's a variant that's new shale. And here you can see it a little bit closer. These are all natural sheep colors, shades of gray or shades of brown and white. This is a sampler stole or scarf with a variety of patterns. And the part of the skill of the knitter is in choosing lace patterns that transition nicely from one to the next. And that outside border would have been knitted separately. I found this picture in amongst Norman's photographs, and I just really like it because they're not wearing anything fancy. These are big shawls that they would have worn on a regular basis. Some women would have a smaller shawl for their head and one for their shoulders. And also they look so cheery. This is the back of my head. This is a shawl designed by my friend Martha Owen, who is the resident spinner, knitter, dyer at the John C. Campbell Folk School. Someone brought a shawl back from Shetland, and asked Martha if she could work up a pattern from it. So she reverse engineered a pattern. Now this shawl came from Shetland, but it's in the Faroese style in that it has a central motif and then triangular pieces on the sides. And it's a particularly graceful shawl to wear because it's kind of wing shaped and it sits quite nicely on the shoulders. It's not inclined to work its way back and fall off. This shawl, you cast on 7 stitches for the border and knit the whole border section we see at the bottom with the little points. Then as you're knitting that, you do a yarn over at the beginning of every row. So it's very easy to pick up the stitches for the body of the shawl and establish a 5-stitch garter section at either side, which you can see up at my top of my neck there. And you work 1 large lace motif, do some decreases just above that on a return knitting row, and then just work the central motifs, doing decreases after each of those motifs up the spine. And when you're done, you have about 10 inches of live stitches on the needle. You continue that little garter border and knit 2 together at that to eat up all those live stitches. And when you're done, you have 5 stitches to graft to 5 other stitches, and that's your finish. So you cast on 7 and you never purl, and you graft 5 stitches to each other at the end. It's really quite ingenious pattern. And this lady slipped over the title page. Now we're moving on into Fair Isle knitting. And this is a lovely painting of a woman, and the style of hat she's wearing is called a cap. And so we're going to talk about color work now. See, she's on the wrong side of the title page. Okay, let me have another input. So all of these types of knitting have come in and out of style since they first began. And one of the ways that Shetland lace was brought to the world was by a Shetland woman who sent a beautiful lace baby cap to the Queen of England for one of her babies, and possibly also a shawl, like for a christening shawl. And the Queen thought they were charming. She loved them. She showed her friends. It was talked about in the newspaper, and people started trying to find out how they could get lace from Shetland. Well, here we have the Prince of Wales, who was soon to be king, but not for long. And this was at a time period when sportswear became popular. And also women began to indulge also in sport. And so here we have the Prince of Wales in a merry mood, as the card says, and he's wearing a Fair Isle vest. Here we have a painted portrait of him in a colorwork Fair Isle jumper, carrying that charming little dog. This type of knitting is named for Fair Isle, but is practiced throughout Shetland and also other parts of England. Traditionally, there are only 2 colors in a row. It's worked in the round with steeks. Sometimes steeks are called brigs, which is a Scots word for bridge. There might be 5 or 7 or 9 colors in a garment. The earliest garments were made with natural sheep colors and were plant dyed. Later garments used a lot more shading in the foreground and the background as more colors were available. The earliest, we'll see some of the earlier plant dyed sweaters that are a lot of predominantly red and blue. So madder, indigo, and local plants that produce golds and browns. So here we have another charming pattern leaflet. I love how this lady's shoulder pads and her hairdo kind of, go together. And she's got a lovely colorwork sweater. And there's an option in this leaflet for one with just colorwork at the yoke edges there. Here is a lady from Shetland working on a garment. She's using a knitting belt, but we can't see it. And this sweater, whether or not these yarns have been plant dyed, this particular style of color is based on those early madder, indigo, walnut, whatever local plants you could get browns and golds from. Here is a postcard with all kinds of garments that have been identified to specific time periods. So it is interesting to see how the designs have changed. And one of the interesting things is that the Norwegian star that you also see in a lot of Norwegian knitting popped up during and after World War II, because many people from Norway passed through Shetland. The Shetlanders helped them escape from the Nazis when Norway was invaded and occupied. There was a whole system called the Shetland bus that allowed people to come by sea to Shetland and then be transferred to other countries. And so they brought their knitting on their back, many of these people. And all of a sudden, the Norwegian star and more of a vertical patterning started popping up. So you see this man's all over from the 1950s. There's one at the bottom from the 1950s, and we'll see others. This is one of the oldest garments in the Shetland Museum, and this would have been madder and indigo and some other local dyes. Being a country with lots of islands and sea, they had access to trade goods. So that's where the indigo would have come from. This is a photograph from the Shetland Museum, as you can see, and this man wearing his cap and his sweater. These are also some of those earlier garments with that same kind of coloration. And we see a set of double-ended knitting needles. They would call them pins, or Norman calls them pins. And also the sheath that you see in the lower left-hand corner, these were sometimes used like a knitting belt, tucked into a belt, and then your knitting needle forced into it. And the padding in this may have been from goose feathers. And we get a little closer on that. And you can see various motifs. Sometimes you get trees, sometimes you get these oxo patterns, O's and X's, or in this case, O's and crosses. And the smaller patterns that appear between those larger motifs are called peerie, P-E-E-R-I-E, and it's the Shetland word for small. It's just a little pattern, 3, 5, maybe 7 rows. This is a piece from the 1940s, where it became the vogue to use lighter backgrounds and slightly different, what would have been more modern motifs at that point. And you start to see a little bit of shading in here too, using different colors as you pass through a larger motif. Here's another postcard with a bunch of different colorwork motifs from a variety of sweaters from the Shetland Museum. Here's a group of scarves. We have 2 with those light colored backgrounds. The one on the right would have been an older design, and the one in the center kind of splits the difference between them. This is a bulletin board from the Shetland Museum. Lots of swatches and a couple of garments. These are in that more traditional colorway, but more modern interpretations of that, the use of hearts. These are really neatly balanced motifs, really beautifully done swatches. This is a pattern advertising these sweaters, but I particularly liked the natural colorway of the one on the right with all the kind of peaty, mossy greens and browns and things. That is one of Norman's sweaters with the Norwegian star. And the one in the background on the right is one of Hazel Tyndall's sweaters. Pretty sure that's right. This is just a group that I enjoyed for a variety of color. And also kind of the astonishment of the number of hours that went into this little group of garments. It's just amazing. This is a modern sweater done in those kind of a brighter a version of those old indigo and madder colors, but it's very successful design-wise. It's beautiful. This is Hazel Tyndall modeling one of her designs, and this is a sweater that she knitted for a competition. So it has more colors than she typically used, but she shades in and out of all these different colors. It's quite a fancy garment. This is more typical. This particular sweater is in this lovely autumn kind of colorway that I'm particularly fond of, with the greens and the russet tones. And you have these larger motifs with a peary between them. In this case, it almost looks like pairs of leaves. This is a sweater that was knitted in Shetland. This is one of Martha Owen's sweaters that she brought back, but it has this vertical patterning. We've got half Norwegian stars at the center. There's really beautiful shading. And the next picture gets you in a little bit closer so you can see the brilliance of the color choices. So this sweater predominantly has this dark red background and a light foreground, but the light colors shift into different light colored heathers. And the use of heathered yarns also provides an incredible amount of depth. So you can imagine if these were solid colors, it would be much more crisp and not as subtle. But you also wouldn't have the same subtlety of color, particularly, let's go back. So you don't notice those little details. And from a distance, it's fairly graphic and has a very strong Norwegian influence. But when you get close, you get to see part of what makes up what you see from a distance. This is all natural colors straight from the sheep, browns and grays, beautifully done with a key pattern as the peary between the other motifs. And I haven't talked about corrugated ribbing. So this sweater has corrugated ribbing at the neckline and on the button band. And this is, I don't have a date for when this came in, but I think of it as a more modern adaptation. You don't find it on the oldest sweaters. And it's a way of using the color palette from the body of the sweater in the ribbing. It ties it together nicely. It's not a particularly elastic ribbing because you're carrying the second colors behind, so you don't have quite as much stretch. But in terms of design, it's lovely and it matches beautifully, and particularly sweaters that have more colors that can be very creative. This is the inside of a sleeve that was knitted with a steek. Now, a steek is a section of knitting where you add extra stitches just that you're going to cut away. It allows you to continue knitting in the round so that you always knit and never purl. And it's much faster to work that way. Also, when you always face your color pattern, it's easier to keep track of where you are. Whereas if you turn it over and have to go in the opposite direction, just trust me, it's much easier to knit in circles than to go back and forth. And the extra stitches are done in a single color or a checkerboard or vertical stripes. Vertical stripes are great because it gives you such a neat cutting line. The stitches are secured on either side of the cutting line before it's cut. And in the old Shetland garments, they just took those cut ends and tied them together in little square knots. This is not what my home ec teacher told me to do. She said, the inside of your garment must be as beautiful as the outside. But because they're using Shetland wool, which is a little bit sticky, very soft, but it's a wool that melts easily. So these little knots are quite secure. And after a couple of wearings, they're going to start to rub together, become one. It's a very effective and useful way to finish the inside of a garment. This is another sweater that with that Norwegian influence, that vertical, and I love that little tumbling block effect done in color work with the little checkerboards and solids, solid light, solid dark. And you can see the color shading in here. This is Norman. I have more bad pictures of Norman than good ones. I think it's because he's very animated, so you're always catching him between faces. That's Martha Owen on the left. This is, oh gosh, 20 years ago at least. And I took this this picture's in here because I love the sweater she's wearing. It's one of my favorites. She brought it back from Shetland. This is what it looks like up close. It's got a lot of colors in it, and they're very subtle. And I also like the cardigan with the little clasps on it. I just think that's a nice style. This is a sweater that was knitted by my friend Elizabeth Johnston, who's from Shetland. She grew up, when she got old enough, her mother would would have Elizabeth and her sister knit the plain bodies of the yoke Fair Isle sweaters that were so popular at that time. Many of you probably have them, may have them still. Often lovely pastel colors and just a colored curved yoke at the top with the color work there. And Elizabeth hand spins and dyes and knits sweaters, bespoke sweaters. She takes commissions. She also sells her hand spun, and all of the knitting that she's done, certainly as long as I've known her, which is 25 years, I think, she only works with her own hand spun. And so this is a sweater. She had just arrived from Shetland, and it's set up on a woolly horse to block. So the woolly horse has some vertical, well, you can see it has a hinge, so you can fold it in half. That makes it much easier to dress. And it has adjustments so that the vertical poles can be moved out or in to fit the size of the particular sweater. And it has an angled pole at the lower end of the arm that can also be moved up and down. She would have laced the bottom edge of the sweater so that she could tie that to the lowest part of the woolly horse. She might also have laced the neckline just to draw it in a little so that it would block at a slightly smaller circumference. And the purpose of this is, once you've finished colorwork knitting, it doesn't look like much. It's kind of a little lumpy and bumpy, but once it's been washed and blocked, it settles into place and looks terrific, looks very professional. So this is the traditional style of blocking for garments that's used not just in Shetland, also in other parts of England, called a woolly horse. And this may be that same sweater up close. You can also see the corrugated ribbing on it. This is in that old style coloration, imitating the madder and indigo. This is a beautiful vest that was hand spun, dyed with indigo and cochineal, and designed and knitted by Carla Owen, who, when I first came to the folk school over 25 years ago, Carla was the weaving resident at the weaving studio there. She's Martha Owen's sister-in-law. Sadly, we lost her about a year ago, maybe a year and a half now. But she was a brilliant, brilliant natural dyer, and she wanted to show that you could make a successful garment out of just 2 dyes. And so this is her garment, and see how she used her corrugated ribbing at the bottom to show off her various colors. This is the sweater that Norman spun and knitted. And again, that vertical Norwegian star, all natural sheep's colors, really beautiful garment. And then here's Norman with a jumper he made. Jumper would be the word for a pullover. I've had long, ridiculous conversations with Norman about if a pullover is a jumper, then why is a cardigan a cardigan? Anyway, we don't need to go there, but it's there's a set of words, and as Americans, we may or may not know them or use them interchangeably. Anyway, here's his jumper. He spun, dyed, and knitted this jumper, and it has a lot more Peary patterns in it. And when he was done, he had a lot of yarn left over, so he knit the scarf. And we'll see these a little bit up close, but first we'll see a few more of his. This is one that he spun, dyed, just that red, and knitted. This is a Norwegian style sweater, a thicker yarn, the use of a ribbon to bind the front edge, also knitted in the round and steeked, but just a slightly different style. But there's that Norwegian star on a Norwegian sweater. Here's another sweater Norman made, and I find this one interesting because it's color work, but he placed the color work the way you would place design in a Gansey sweater. So it's really nicely done, very effective. And he may have copied this off one he's seen, you know, that he just saw someone wearing one day and thought, oh, I like that. I'll make something like that. Here we get a little bit closer on that scarf. There are some really zippy bright colors. You can get some pretty hot stuff out of cochineal with a variety of mordants. But there are also some very subtle colorations in here. Here's a close-up of his jumper, so you can see the whole thing. It's got 3 repeats of his set of pattern, but there's a variation of color throughout. And here we get in a little closer, so you can see those patterns. And a lot, his use of color is not as subtle as a lot of the Shetlanders would be, but it's quite successful. And then we'll see some sections of his scarf. There's that crazy hot pink color. And then he used all the yarn that he had left together to make the fringes. So it's pretty dramatic, this scarf. Here's a set of swatches from the Shetland Museum. This is not my photo, nice photo. I love the corrugated ribbing. You get a sense of how that works with the purl stitches in this case. Just a really nice subtle trim for that garment. This is a really evocative photo for selling this particular design, but it's very pretty. And I'm pretty sure this is my last picture. This is Martha and Norman. And this was taken while they were co-teaching a spinning class at the John C. Campbell Folk School. Some of you who've been there will recognize the red floor of the wet room. And Martha is wearing yet another of the beautiful Shetland sweaters that she's brought back from her Shetland trips. And that's what we got. So, and that was almost an hour, and I didn't lose my voice yet.
Thank you, Melissa. That was terrific.
You're welcome.
Hang on. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so in the chat, Patty, I
just see one question.
Yeah, there was a question about, was it the, which Dublin museum was it the Aran sweater that you showed that was in a museum?
I can't answer that question, but if I check Gladys Thompson's book when I get home, she may have cited the museum. I can probably find it out. So when I send the resource list, I'll include that information on that list.
All right. There is an interesting question here regarding Wales. Karen noticed it wasn't included. Is there no knitting tradition there?
So I would love to know more about Wales. So I read recently that Wales had a very short-lived woolen industry, and Wales I have not been there except to pass through on a train coming and going from Ireland to London. And I have a book about Welsh quilts, and there's a whole tradition that is industrial of beautiful double woven Welsh blankets and later women's coats made from those blankets. And all of these are little teasers. I just don't, I don't have the person the way I do have Norman to feed me information, and I haven't visited and explored. So I know there are traditions in Wales, but I don't know what they are. I know a little bit more about the music there, but yeah, I would like to know more about Wales too. Wales certainly had Ganseys, but the 2 researchers that I'm most aware of, which is Gladys Thompson and Michael Pearson, did not go to Wales on their research trips. And I don't know if that was political or if it was related to language issues, but they certainly have shoreline and harbors and fisher people. So they certainly either had variations on Ganseys or something very similar to them. Yeah.
There was a question about is there a pattern for the red shawl? And then Margaret just posted it from Ravelry in the chat.
Right. And
Melissa, do you know if she's still selling it? Because I know the Yarn Circle closed, and that's where I bought my copy of the pattern.
right, yeah. So Martha doesn't have any online sales, but if you contact her, she will. And I'm pretty sure I'll include her email address on the resource list if it's not already there.
Okay. And here's a question about, could you talk about the ways in which these knitting traditions might have come to Canada and the US?
So all of these textile traditions came with people. People brought with them what they knew how to do when they came to North America. So interestingly, the wool walking tradition that was primarily done by women in Scotland, when those people came to what became the maritime provinces of Canada, by and by that became a male tradition, and the content of the songs shifted. But they brought their weaving and spinning and knitting traditions with them and made similar garments. You know, when they came to this country, they brought their techniques, all of these things. And actually there's a good book about Canadian knitting traditions. I don't know how available it is in the US, and it came out maybe 20 years ago. So there are people who have explored, you know, this tradition. And Canada, of course, has other input. There are the Cowichan sweaters from the West Coast that have a Native American influence, or native, yeah, I guess they're still Native Americans. So a lot of these things came over and continued. Rebecca Fox asked about Eriskay. Eriskay Ganzis they're almost like a patchwork of more different types of designs. And they also, Eriskay includes lace patterning in their Ganzis. And a couple of people have mentioned to me some stories about how the Eriskay patterning came to be, but I don't have a solid foundation for that. When I first told Norman that I wanted to knit a Ganzi, he said, "Don't make one of those Eriskay ones." and I was like, "But they're so pretty. I love them. They're really nice." And he sort of poo-pooed that. I have a feeling it was a later development, and it may simply have been like, can we have something that's ours, that's, you know, that's different and stands for our place? But I know there are other stories about it. Margaret asked about needles for the earlier Ganzis, and I'll tell you, Norman always tells the story about asking his grandmother where she got her knitting needles, because there weren't any wool stores. And she said, "I went to the hardware, of course," or whatever they called it. She would go and get steel, lengths of steel, and they'd cut it to more or less the length. And he said, "Well, how did you make points?" She said, "On the granite doorstep, of course. How else would you do it?" So they would get lengths of steel and then go out on their doorsteps, which were all granite in Scotland, and just rub and turn until they had a usable point on their needles. And they called them pins, long pins. You might have shorter pins for socks. Ganzis, Karen asked about if Ganzis are typically made from a particular type of sheep wool. Ganzis traditionally are knit with, when commercial yarns became available, it's a 5-ply yarn that is about equivalent to a sport weight, but it's very tightly twisted and very tightly plied. So it's not much fun to work with. You can buy traditional Ganzi wool on the cone. It'll be on the resource list. And it's traditionally knitted on smaller needles, like a US size 3, so that you get that tight, dense fabric. Modern knitters who are making Ganzis that they aren't going to wear to sea as a primary garment tend to use softer yarns and larger needles and knit it more to a drapable fabric. And that's our option as modern knitters, is to knit a garment that will be useful in our lives. I'm not aware of specific sheep breeds, although I kind of associate Gansey wool with like tweed wool. So it would have been medium grade, more meat sheep, possibly down type sheep, just depending on where you were and what was available. And Rebecca asked about the walking songs. So I'm not sure how this evolved. I'll have to ask Norman that question the next time I see him. My thought is in Scotland, it was a women's activity. Men were sometimes allowed to come and listen. If there weren't enough women, they might participate, but it was really a women's activity, much like a quilting bee. It was social. It gave them a chance to talk together. Weaving was indoor work done in the winter months. So walkings would take place in the spring when the weather was a little better. You could be outdoors. And there was certainly a lot of gossip. All the songs had choruses, because they're work songs that help people work in a rhythm together. And some of those had verses that you could ad lib and mention maybe that young lady whose apron doesn't fit anymore because she's getting a belly on her, and who's she been with? And, there'd be all kinds of gossip going on. Like many traditions that came across the ocean, the social structures were similar, but there were opportunities for change. And so things did evolve in this country. And I see the men saying, "Oh, you ladies, that looks like a lot of hard work. Really, I think you should let us help you out," and sort of elbowing their way into this and then kind of taking it over. Like, they wanted to have their own social thing, but I don't have any scholarship to back that up. That's like my notion of it. Somebody asked about demonstrations of knitting with knitting belts, and another Audrey Morris put up a link this is in the chat, of a website where you can see knitting belt techniques. And Sarah also mentioned that there are walking songs on YouTube. Somewhere floating around, there's a video of me doing a walking at the Tropical Florida Weavers Conference a couple of years ago. And I'll just mention, because it was unusual. One, it was the biggest piece of cloth I've ever walked. It was a pair of blankets, and we had 2 huge banquet tables. But the other part was that we started the walking and we did maybe one song. And then someone looked at their watch and said, "Oh, the launch is happening." And we all put everything down and trotted outside to stand by the lakeshore to watch for NASA to launch a rocket. And we watched a crocodile swim by I guess it's an alligator, in the water. It was just, and then someone said, "Oh no, the launch, they've postponed it. We have another half hour." And we all trooped back inside and went back to walking the wool. So we had 3 more songs, and then we trooped out to watch the rocket launch again. It was just the technology of hand finishing this cloth that was hand woven on a hand loom and going out to watch this rocket. It was just, that'll never happen again. It was really interesting. So I know there's some video of that. I would tell you to go to YouTube and search under my name, but during the pandemic, I posted a song a day. And so there are 264 songs. So you can find some video of me walking, but you might have to wade through a lot of music. I do have a channel, but I think I can only post my own videos there. If you're interested in music, you can go find my channel. But if you put my name and walking, WAULKING, you might come up with some of those. And also they're wonderful old songs. I sing traditional songs in England for walking. Walking songs traditionally would have been in Gaelic, but I don't have a handle on Gaelic, so I don't try to sing it. But there are many recordings, archival recordings of people singing walking songs, and and they're fun to listen to. It's interesting. Did I miss any questions?
Look like,
I don't think you missed any in the chat. Does anybody, you can raise your hand if on screen under reactions, and we can see if anybody has any other questions.
I have a quick question. This is Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Melissa. I have a question about the grist of the hand spun yarn for the Ganseys, for, because you mentioned it a little bit, but the Ganseys with a 5-ply, but it's sport weight. The wraps per inch must be incredible. But then also the hand spun for Aran versus Fair Isle, just kind of to get an idea of, should one want to do that, preparing for it, what do you have to do?
So interestingly, the words in Britain for their yarn styles, they'll talk about jumper weight yarn, which for us would be sock weight. And jumper weight yarn is what's used to knit color work, Fair Isle. So it's a sock weight yarn. The Gansey yarn is a 5-ply, but it's fairly close to sport weight. And one of their yarn sizes is Aran. And Aran yarn typically knits up at 4.5 stitches to the inch on a size 7 needle, somewhere in that ballpark. The Aran sweaters from the Aran Islands were knitted with a thicker yarn at that gauge. And actually, for a while, for many years, Norman traveled in the winter. He is from Scotland. I didn't talk about Norman. Sometimes I talk about him before I do anything else because it explains some things. He's from Aberdeen. He came to the Newport Folk Festival in 1961 to represent Scotland. And the last time I saw him, he told me a story about going on stage and no one could figure out what he was going to do because he didn't have any instruments, and just him in a chair. And he did his set. And when his set was over, Bob Dylan came on and did his famous electric set, which caused a riot. And I'd never heard him tell this story before. He's going to be 89.
oh,
Yeah, he's going to be 89 in August. I talked to him and he says, if I live, I'll be 89 on my next birthday. So anyway, he came to Newport. He said he smelled freedom and he made connections. He met people. He came back and lived in the United States from, let's say, the middle 60s. He was, for 5 or 6 years, the master weaver at Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. He worked with Ralph Rinsler to help start the Folklife Festival on the Mall for the Smithsonian. And eventually he met the woman who was his patroness, that's his word, who helped start the Marshfield School of Weaving. And that was where I met him in the early 80s. And now I've forgotten why I'm talking about Norman. Dear. Oh, okay, I got it. I'm back on the track. So for many years, he, when he stopped running the school, he would leave home between Christmas and New Year's, maybe come and perform for the first night that my husband and I ran a concert series. So New Year's Eve performance, stay at my house for a few weeks, then I'd take him to the folk school, he'd teach a class, and then he'd continue to travel from friend to friend and teach all across the US, ending up in California. And he'd go back to Vermont, where he's lived for decades now, long about April. If he was lucky, he'd miss mud season even. So it was a pretty good deal. And one of the classes that we had him teach when he came through Virginia, one year he taught spinning for Shetland knitting, for color work, for Fair Isle knitting. One year he taught spinning for Aran sweaters. And he did do also a Gansey class. So we talked about in those classes knitting to a particular grist and a particular style of yarn for each of these different techniques. He's not a lace knitter. He's quite capable of spinning lace weight yarn, but he's never been a lace knitter. So these are the traditions that he's familiar with, and he's created garments. And his Gansey yarn is finer and more tightly twisted. than his Aran yarn, which is just that much thicker and a softer yarn. And then the Fair Isle is fine if you can spin to that grist, more of a sock yarn weight. But it's not, I like to use sock yarn as a reference for the size of the yarn, but Shetland yarn that is commercially spun today for knitting is lighter and softer and not very tightly twisted. If I were buying yarn to knit socks with, I would want it to have more twists so it would be more durable. But to knit a Fair Isle garment, you want your yarn to be quite light because you're always working with two yarns and it's essentially a two-layered garment. So you want it to not be too heavy. You want it to have some more drape to it. Just the quality of the garment that you're trying to achieve is quite different.
Melissa, did they always use plied yarn? Was there ever a use for singles?
Not for knitting, especially for garments that are knit in the round. Because I don't know if you've ever taken a singles yarn and knit in the round, but you'll make the equivalent of a Chinese finger trap. It will continue. the energy that's in that singles yarn will continue to work, and your tube will not remain a tube. If you've ever bought a t-shirt made with linen yarn, all my linen shirts, I have to grab the hem and the arm and give them a mighty yank out of the dryer because they torque. So the Shetland Fair Isle yarns are a 2-ply yarn. The Gansey I mentioned is traditionally a 5-ply yarn. The Aran yarns would have been 2 or 3-ply.
It's like Jerry has a question.
Yes. For some reason, I can't seem to send anything to the chat. But my question is this: are Fair Isle scarves also knitted in the round? And if so, does that make them 2 thicknesses?
Actually 4, because they're tubular. So yes, you would traditionally they'd be knit in the round. So you'd have those 2 layers, but you'd have 2 of them flat after you've finished your jumper.
Okay.
Nancy Reeves asked if Norman spins all of his yarns woolen. He does spin woolen for knitting, and he spun worsted for spinning sometimes. He spun woolen. So the first class that I did at Marshfield was a 6-week class, and you walked in the door knowing basically nothing. We learned to card, we learned to spin, we spun a woolen yarn, and we plied it and used that as the weft for a small blanket. At the end of 2 weeks, we made a small blanket. And then we spent 4 weeks spinning singles pencil roving for the weft of our tartan blanket. And we used a commercial singles for a mule spun singles from Bartlett for the warp. So for blankets, we also used woolen style, woolen spun yarn. But he does use worsted for various things. The earliest tartans in Scotland would have been spindle spun worsted, very tight, firm, strong yarn used for warp and weft. So I think generally speaking, we find more worsted yarn in weaving, but maybe not for blankets so much, where you want loft for warmth. I hope that answered your question.
Are there any other questions from anyone? All right, Melissa, thank you so much.
I think that was really wonderful.
Oh, yeah, it was
Thank you.
terrific. And lots of compliments in the chat.
I'm really glad you enjoyed it, and I'm really glad my voice didn't fail. It got pretty dicey there.
Yeah, you did fine.
Yeah, it was perfect. Very good.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again. And thank you everybody for attending, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. All right. Goodbye.